Margaret Olsen's canvas tent stretched 30 feet around her entire log cabin, creating the frontier's strangest sight, but keeping 4 cords of firewood bone dry while her neighbors lost half their fuel to rot and ice. When the blizzard of 1873 trapped families with soaked wood that wouldn't burn, 23 people survived in Margaret's tent-wrapped home, warmed by the perfectly dry fuel everyone had mocked her for protecting. Drop a comment with your location and subscribe for more remarkable frontier survival stories. The first winter after Eric Olsen's death taught Margaret lessons no widow should learn. December 1872 in the Dakota Territory brought snow that fell sideways, ice that coated everything, and temperatures that turned breath into crystals before it left her mouth. But the cold wasn't what nearly killed her and her 3 children. It was the wet firewood that refused to burn, hissing and smoking in the stove while ice formed inside their cabin walls. Margaret had stacked her wood properly in October, following every rule the frontier demanded, raised off the ground on poles covered with bark slabs, positioned for air circulation, but the horizontal snow driven by prairie winds found every gap. Ice storms coated the pile, brief thaws soaked the wood before hard freezes locked moisture deep in every log. By January, starting a fire required an hour of coaxing with precious dry kindling, and even then, wet logs produced more smoke than heat. The night of January 15th nearly ended everything. The children huddled in bed together while Margaret fought to ignite sodden logs. Little Anna's cough had worsened, requiring warmth for medicine preparation. The supposedly seasoned oak hissed mockingly as Margaret wasted their last newspaper and dry twigs. Smoke filled the cabin while temperatures dropped. In desperation, she burned their wooden spoons, then chair rungs, finally pages from Eric's Bible, crying as sacred words became survival fuel. Dawn brought neighbor Thomas Garrett with terrible news. The Swenson family had frozen to death 2 miles north. Their woodpile, exposed to the same conditions, had failed completely. Margaret found them still in bed, looking peaceful, their stove cold with wet wood stacked beside it. The image burned into her mind. This wasn't just about comfort anymore. Dry firewood meant life. Wet wood meant death. The mathematics were that simple and that terrifying. Standing before her own ice-encrusted woodpile, Margaret made a decision. Traditional methods had failed. The frontier's wisdom about wood storage assumed normal winters, not the horizontal hurricanes of snow that Dakota produced. If she wanted to survive next winter, if she wanted her children to survive, she needed to completely rethink how firewood could be protected. The wet log in her hand weighed twice what it should, water frozen in its fibers. There had to be a better way. By February, Margaret had filled 3 notebooks with observations. She tracked how moisture penetrated wood piles, how wind patterns drove snow, how ice formed and where. The widow that neighbors pitied for her loss was becoming an engineer of necessity, studying failure to design success. Spring 1873 brought Margaret Olsen to the Fort Rice trading post with an unusual request that puzzled even hardened frontier merchants. She needed canvas, not a small piece for wagon repair, but massive quantities typically used for military tents or circus pavilions. The trader, Samuel Morrison, studied her list with growing bewilderment. 300 square feet of heavy duck canvas, 50 pounds of hemp rope, 2 dozen iron stakes, tar for waterproofing, and specialized grommets used in ship rigging. "Planning to join the cavalry, Mrs. Olsen?" Morrison asked, tallying the substantial cost. Margaret's reply was simple: "Planning to keep my children warm next winter." The expense staggered her, nearly $80, representing most of her savings from Eric's life insurance. Neighbors who learned of the purchase thought grief had affected her reason. Martha Brennan whispered at church about poor Margaret wasting her husband's money on cloth. But Margaret had spent months calculating exactly what she needed, drawing from memories of military supply tents she'd seen during the war, and coastal fishing operations, where canvas protected valuable equipment from harsh weather. Her design was revolutionary for the frontier. Rather than simply covering a wood pile, she planned to enclose her entire cabin and fuel supply within a single protective envelope. The tent would stand independently on poles, creating an air gap between canvas and cabin walls. This dead space would moderate temperature, prevent snow accumulation against the house, and most critically, provide completely protected storage for firewood in a ring around the structure. Construction began in June when the ground was soft for stake placement. Margaret's children, Hans at 12, Greta at 10, and little Anna at 6, became her work crew. They helped stretch guy lines, hold poles vertical, and spread waterproofing compound. The framework rose first, tall poles at corners connected by ridge beams, creating a skeleton that would support the canvas without touching the cabin itself. The engineering required careful calculation of snow loads and wind resistance. The canvas work demanded skills Margaret had never imagined needing. She learned to sew heavy seams using sailmaker's techniques, her hands cramping from forcing needles through multiple layers. Waterproofing required painting every seam with pine tar mixed with linseed oil, a process that took days and left everything reeking. Installing grommets for rope attachment meant borrowing blacksmith tools and teaching herself metalwork. Each challenge was met with determination born from remembering wetwood's deadly consequences. Neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle with amusement turning to mockery. Olsen's circus tent, they called it. Thomas Garrett joked about selling tickets to see the lady who lives in a tent. Even sympathetic friends like Sarah Mitchell worried aloud. "Margaret, dear, you're spending everything on this contraption. What if it doesn't work?" But Margaret continued methodically, driven by mathematics of survival. Dry wood equaled life, and nothing else mattered. By August, the structure stood complete, a massive tent surrounding her cabin with 10 feet of covered space on all sides for wood storage. September 1873 transformed Margaret Olsen's tent-wrapped cabin into the frontier's most ambitious firewood storage facility. While neighbors stacked their wood in traditional exposed piles, Margaret orchestrated a complex system within her canvas shelter that would revolutionize winter fuel management. The space between tent walls and cabin became a carefully organized warehouse where 4 full cords of split wood would remain perfectly dry regardless of outside conditions. The organization followed principles Margaret developed through careful study. Wood nearest the cabin walls consisted of quick-burning pine and cottonwood for easy fire starting. The middle ring held steady-burning oak and ash for maintaining heat. The outer ring against the canvas stored elm and hackberry for overnight burns. Each section was raised on wooden platforms she constructed from salvaged lumber, allowing air circulation beneath. Between the rows, she maintained walking paths for easy access without disturbing the stacks. Ventilation proved crucial to prevent mold and maintain dryness. Margaret installed adjustable flaps at ground level and peak, creating convection currents that continuously moved air through the space. The design borrowed from grain storage principles. Keeping contents dry required airflow, not just coverage. She positioned these vents to avoid prevailing wind directions that might drive snow inside while still maintaining circulation. The engineering exceeded anything neighbors attempted with simple tarp coverings. The financial investment in firewood shocked the community. Margaret purchased 4 full cords at premium prices, selecting only properly seasoned wood. Most families made do with 2 cords, supplemented by whatever they could scavenge. But Margaret's calculations showed that dry wood burned 50% more efficiently than moisture-compromised fuel. Her investment in quantity would pay dividends in reduced consumption and consistent heat. She also negotiated splitting and delivery, recognizing that proper sizing mattered for efficient burning. Loading the wood became a community spectacle in October. Margaret hired local boys to help, paying them in fresh bread and preserves. They formed a chain, passing split logs through the tent opening while Margaret directed placement with military precision. Each piece was inspected for moisture content and size before positioning. The boys initially joked about Widow Olsen's wood palace, but grew impressed by the systematic approach. Young Tom Garrett later told his father, "She knows exactly where every stick goes and why." The tent modifications continued through autumn. Margaret added interior hooks for tools, shelving for kindling boxes, and designated areas for wood splitting during storms. She installed a small work table where she could prepare fire starters protected from weather. Most innovatively, she created a covered passage from her cabin door to the wood storage, eliminating exposure while fetching fuel. This detail, mocked as excessive, would prove life-saving when blizzards made even short outside ventures dangerous. By November's first snow, Margaret's preparation was complete. 4 cords of bone-dry wood surrounded her cabin like a wooden fortress within canvas walls. Neighbors shook their heads at the expense and effort, but Margaret felt something they didn't: security. The blizzard that struck Dakota Territory on November 28, 1873, arrived with violence that old-timers called unprecedented. By noon, horizontal snow had reduced visibility to arm's length. Temperatures plummeted 40 degrees in 3 hours. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour, driving ice crystals that could strip skin. Margaret Olsen watched from her cabin window as the storm assaulted her canvas shelter, the tent walls billowing and snapping like ship sails in a hurricane. Inside the tent enclosure, however, an eerie calm prevailed. The wooden walls of her cabin felt no direct wind. Snow couldn't accumulate against doors or windows. Most remarkably, the firewood stacks remained completely untouched by the storm's fury. While neighbors would later describe snow penetrating every possible crack in their wood coverings, Margaret's multi-layered defense held perfectly. The tent shed snow before it could accumulate, while the air gap prevented any moisture from reaching the precious fuel. The temperature difference astounded her. Outside the tent, -20, and falling. Inside the tent, but outside the cabin, a relatively balmy 0 degrees. Inside the cabin itself, a comfortable 65 maintained by her efficient stove, burning bone-dry wood. She used half the fuel she'd needed the previous winter for better heat. The dry wood caught instantly, burned completely, and produced minimal smoke. Her chimney drew perfectly without the creosote buildup that plagued wetwood burners. By the second day, neighbors began arriving. First came the Mitchells, their woodpile already compromised by driven snow. Sarah Mitchell nearly wept seeing Margaret's organized dry stacks. "We've been trying to dry logs by the stove before burning them," she confessed. "It takes hours and fills the house with smoke." Margaret shared armloads of dry kindling, teaching Sarah how properly dried wood should feel and sound when struck together. The Garrett family arrived next, Thomas no longer joking about circus tents. His own traditional woodshed had failed when snow, driven by wind, packed into every opening. Half his wood was already ice-encrusted. His children were cold, his wife frustrated, and his pride wounded. Margaret wordlessly handed him a bundle of dry oak, the wood crackling with low moisture content. "This design," he admitted, "I didn't understand." "Would you show me the construction?" By storm's end, 12 families had visited Margaret's tent for dry wood or advice. She gave freely, remembering her own desperation the previous winter, but more importantly, she educated. She showed them how the tent created multiple defense layers: windbreak, snow shed, and air gap. She explained ventilation principles preventing mold. She demonstrated how organized storage meant accessing good wood without disturbing the rest. The tent that had provoked laughter now drew admiration and serious study. Word spread quickly through the settlement. "The widow Olsen's wood is dry as August kindling," became common knowledge. Her children played in the tent's sheltered space while blizzards raged. She split wood comfortably during storms. Most remarkably, she slept through nights without worry, knowing her fuel supply was secure. December 1873 revealed the true financial genius of Margaret Olsen's tent system, as careful record-keeping exposed dramatic differences in fuel consumption. While neighboring families burned through their wood piles at alarming rates, Margaret's dry fuel lasted 60% longer than previous winters. She meticulously documented every log burned, comparing consumption rates to temperature and wind conditions. The data painted a clear picture. Dry wood wasn't just more pleasant to burn, it was economically transformative for frontier survival. The Brennan family's struggle exemplified typical frontier winter economics. With wet wood, they needed to maintain larger, hotter fires to achieve minimal warmth, consuming nearly a cord per month. At $3 per cord, their heating costs threatened to bankrupt them by spring. Martha Brennan visited Margaret weekly, increasingly desperate as their wood disappeared into inefficient smoke and steam. "We burn twice what you do for half the heat," she lamented, watching Margaret's modest fire maintain comfortable temperatures. Margaret began teaching what she called fire economics to interested neighbors. She demonstrated how dry wood's complete combustion extracted maximum heat from each log. Wet wood wasted energy, evaporating moisture before producing heat. Her calculations showed that investing in proper storage paid for itself through reduced consumption within a single season. The $80 spent on canvas saved her $40 in reduced wood purchases, plus immeasurable savings in health and comfort. The children's health provided another economic argument. Dr. Morrison from Fort Rice charged $2 per visit, expensive for frontier families. The previous winter, Margaret had paid $12 for treatments related to cold and smoke exposure. This winter, her children remained healthy in the consistently warm, smoke-free environment. Little Anna's persistent cough disappeared entirely. The medical savings alone justified a quarter of the tent's cost. Labor efficiency multiplied the benefits. Fetching dry wood from organized storage took minutes versus the hours neighbors spent trying to find and dry usable fuel during storms. Margaret calculated she saved 3 hours daily in fire maintenance, time redirected to income-producing activities like sewing and baking for sale. Her fresh bread, baked with consistent heat from dry wood, became sought after in the settlement, adding unexpected income to the household budget. By Christmas, Margaret had recovered half her canvas investment through wood savings and increased productivity. Neighbors who'd mocked her spending now sought loans to construct their own shelters. Thomas Garrett publicly apologized for his ridicule, admitting at the Christmas social, "Mrs. Olsen understood what none of us saw. Proper storage isn't an expense, but an investment. She'll save more in 2 winters than the rest of us spend in 5. The settlement's banker, Harold McPherson, took particular notice. He began offering loans for wood storage improvements, recognizing that families with dry fuel were more likely to survive and repay debts. Margaret's innovation had transformed from personal solution to community economics lesson. The widow mocked for wasting money had become the settlement's most consulted expert on winter resource management. January 15, 1874, brought the kind of storm that killed indiscriminately across the Dakota frontier. Temperature dropped to -45. Wind chill calculations would later estimate -80. Visibility disappeared in a white wall of horizontal ice. The storm struck during midday, trapping people wherever they stood. Within hours, Margaret Olsen's tent-wrapped cabin transformed from personal innovation to community lifeline as desperate neighbors sought shelter. The Garrett family arrived first, Thomas carrying his youngest daughter, while his wife led their 2 boys through the howling wilderness of white. They'd run out of dry wood completely, their stove cold, ice forming inside their cabin. Margaret immediately brought them into her warm home, but more importantly, she had dry fuel to share. As Thomas loaded his arms with seasoned oak, tears froze on his weathered cheeks. "We would have died tonight," he said simply. Within hours, more families appeared like ghosts from the storm. The Mitchells, the Brennans, young couple John and Mary Swenson with their newborn. Each told similar stories: wet wood that wouldn't burn, stoves that produced only smoke, temperatures dropping dangerously inside their homes. Margaret's tent became a gathering point, its bright canvas walls visible further than any structure in the whiteout conditions. The space between tent and cabin, mocked as wasteful, now sheltered 23 people. Organization emerged from necessity. Margaret directed families to different areas within the tent's protection. Men took shifts maintaining fires using her dry wood supply. Women prepared communal meals on her consistently hot stove. Children played safely in the sheltered tent space, while blizzard winds that would kill in minutes raged inches away. The tent's interior, while not warm, stayed 40 degrees warmer than outside, the difference between life and death. The wood distribution system Margaret implemented showed remarkable foresight. Rather than depleting her own supply, she taught families to contribute what dry wood they had to a common pool, which was then distributed based on need. Families with infants received priority. Those with sick members got extra rations. The organized storage within the tent made this systematic sharing possible, something that would have been chaos with traditional scattered wood piles. Stories emerged during those trapped days that would become settlement legend. Mary Swenson's baby, born just weeks before, survived because consistent heat allowed proper warming of milk and blankets. Old Henrik Nordstrom, suffering from pneumonia, recovered in the steady warmth while he certainly would have died in his failing cabin. Children who should have been terrified played games and attended makeshift school lessons Sarah Mitchell organized, the tent creating normalcy within catastrophe. When the storm finally broke after 4 days, every person who had sheltered in Margaret's tent survived. The settlement lost 11 souls who hadn't reached shelter in time, but none who made it to the canvas sanctuary. As families departed with bundles of dry wood to restart their lives, many wept with gratitude. The tent had saved their lives, but more importantly, it had shown them community survival required innovation and sharing. Margaret's personal solution had become collective salvation. Spring 1874 brought unprecedented demand for Margaret Olsen's construction expertise as surviving settlers recognized the life-saving potential of tent-wrapped wood storage. What began as whispered requests for advice became formal consultations, with families traveling from neighboring settlements to study the design that had saved 23 lives. Margaret, who'd never considered herself more than a practical widow solving problems, found herself teaching frontier architecture to eager students. The first replication came from Thomas Garrett, his pride completely transformed into determination to protect his family. He arrived at Margaret's cabin with detailed sketches, measurements, and questions that showed serious study. "I measured your angles during the storm," he admitted. "The way wind moves around the canvas, how snow slides off. It's engineering, Mrs. Olsen, pure engineering." Margaret spent days teaching him stake placement, seam sealing, and ventilation principles, refusing payment despite his insistence. Word reached Fort Rice, where Lieutenant Colonel James Davidson commanded troops facing similar winter challenges. Military supplies often failed due to moisture damage, and soldiers suffered from inadequate heating. Davidson sent a formal request for Margaret to consult on military shelter improvements. She arrived at the fort in May with her children, her notebooks, and practiced explanations that transformed a widow's desperation into systematic instruction. The military consultation proved revelatory for both parties. Davidson's engineers had tried complex solutions involving permanent structures and mechanical systems. Margaret's elegant simplicity, canvas creating protected microclimates, seemed almost primitive until they calculated the cost-benefit ratios. Her system could be deployed rapidly, adjusted seasonally, and maintained by anyone. The fort implemented modified versions for ammunition storage, food supplies, and emergency shelters. Commercial interest followed military adoption. Morrison's trading post began stocking Olsen-style tent kits with pre-measured canvas, appropriate stakes, and instruction sheets Margaret had written. She received a percentage of sales, the first income from her innovation. The banker McPherson offered business loans specifically for tent construction, understanding that dry wood meant surviving customers. The settlement's economy shifted as families invested in protection rather than replacing wet fuel. Margaret's teaching evolved into formal classes held in the settlement's church. She demonstrated miniature models showing wind patterns and snow behavior. Her notebooks, filled with observations and calculations, became copied textbooks passed between families. Women particularly embraced the instruction, recognizing that household management included engineering when survival was at stake. The classes grew from local settlers to include travelers who'd heard of the Dakota tent lady, who'd revolutionized winter survival. By summer's end, 17 tent-wrapped structures dotted the settlement landscape. Each reflected personal modifications, some larger, some with additional features, but all following Margaret's core principles. The transformation was visual and cultural. Where individual families once struggled alone with wet wood, now knowledge and resources flowed freely. Margaret's innovation had created not just physical structures, but social ones, bonds formed in shared sanctuary and sustained through collective learning. The widow who'd spent her savings on foolish canvas had become the settlement's most influential resident. Her tent design would spread across the Northern Territories, saving countless lives and transforming frontier wood storage forever. By winter 1874, the transformation of Willow Creek settlement was complete. Where once stood isolated cabins struggling against Dakota winters, now rose a community of tent-wrapped structures, each protecting precious fuel supplies and the families depending on them. Margaret Olsen's desperate innovation, born from grief, had evolved into a frontier revolution that would influence cold weather survival techniques across the American territories for generations. The statistics told a remarkable story. The previous winter of 1872 had claimed 31 lives in the surrounding region from cold-related causes. Winter 1874, despite being equally severe, saw only 3 deaths, all travelers caught between settlements. Every family with tent protection survived. Dr. Morrison documented a 70% reduction in respiratory ailments, attributing the improvement to consistent heat and reduced smoke exposure from dry wood burning. The medical evidence validated what Margaret had discovered through necessity. Economic transformation followed survival success. The settlement's productivity increased dramatically when families no longer spent entire days battling wet wood and failing fires. Women produced more textiles, men completed more winter crafts, and children attended school regularly in warm homes. The banker McPherson calculated that the settlement's economic output had doubled, directly traceable to reliable heating. Investment in tent construction had returned tenfold benefits within 2 seasons. Margaret's personal transformation paralleled the community's. The desperate widow of 1872 had become a confident innovator by 1874, consulting for military installations and teaching classes throughout the territory. Her children thrived in their secure environment, Hans showing aptitude for engineering inspired by his mother's example, Greta becoming a teacher who incorporated practical innovation into lessons, and little Anna growing strong without the persistent coughs that plagued frontier children. The influence spread far beyond Dakota Territory. Railroad companies adopted tent protection for fuel supplies at remote stations. Mining camps in Montana implemented the design for equipment protection. The Canadian Pacific Railway studied Margaret's principles for Arctic construction challenges. What started as one woman's fight against wet firewood became international infrastructure innovation. Engineering journals published articles about the Olsen method of environmental protection. Cultural impact proved equally significant. The frontier tradition of individual struggle against nature shifted toward collective innovation and shared knowledge. Margaret's open teaching, refusing to patent or profit exclusively from her design, established precedents for community-beneficial innovation. Settlements began forming innovation committees, where practical solutions were shared freely. The tent that saved lives also changed how frontier communities approached problems. Margaret Olsen died peacefully in 1912 at age 73, surrounded by grandchildren in a modern house with central heating. Her original tent had long since been replaced, but its principles endured. At her funeral, hundreds gathered to honor the woman who'd transformed frontier survival. Thomas Garrett, now elderly himself, spoke simply, "She showed us that innovation doesn't require education or wealth, just desperation, determination, and willingness to think differently." Today, museum exhibits feature Margaret's original notebooks and tent samples. Modern survival experts study her principles of environmental microclimate creation. But her greatest legacy remains the lives saved, thousands who survived because dry firewood stayed dry all winter. Winter 1875 arrived to find Willow Creek settlement transformed into what passing military patrols called Tent City. 28 families had erected protective canvas shells around their homes, each incorporating lessons learned from Margaret Olsen's original design. The second generation of tent structures showed remarkable innovations as settlers adapted the concept to their specific needs, creating a diverse ecosystem of protected dwellings across the Dakota Prairie. Margaret's own improvements demonstrated continuous innovation. She'd added removable wall panels for summer ventilation, transforming the tent into a shaded work area during hot months. Interior organization evolved with designated tool stations, splitting blocks, and even a small workshop where Hans practiced woodworking protected from weather. The tent had become a year-round asset, not merely winter protection. Her fuel consumption dropped another 20% through better arrangement and optimal wood sizing. The Garrett family's adaptation showcased creative expansion. Thomas had built what he called chambered storage, dividing his tent into sections for different wood types and tools. His innovation included a pulley system for moving heavy logs without strain, inspired by ship rigging. "Mrs. Olsen taught us to think beyond copying," he explained to visitors. "She showed us principles, and we apply them to our own challenges." His fuel efficiency nearly matched Margaret's, validating the knowledge transfer. Unexpected benefits emerged community-wide. The protected spaces between tents and cabins became winter social areas where children played safely and adults worked on crafts. Sarah Mitchell organized a school in her tent space, teaching during blizzards when traditional schoolhouses stood empty. The settlement's productivity continued through winter months instead of grinding to a survival halt. Merchants reported unprecedented winter sales as people had energy for more than basic survival. The storm of January 1875 tested all systems thoroughly. Lasting 9 days with temperatures below -30, it challenged every improvement. Margaret's records showed her tent withstood 90-mile winds without damage, snow loads of 4 feet without collapse, and ice storms without penetration. More importantly, she burned 30% less wood than the previous year through improved arrangement and optimal burning techniques. The investment in canvas had paid dividends beyond calculation. Medical statistics confirmed the transformation. Dr. Morrison's annual report showed respiratory ailments had virtually disappeared among tent-protected families. Frostbite cases dropped to near zero. Child mortality, the frontier's greatest tragedy, decreased by 80% in protected homes. The consistent warmth and dry conditions, Morrison wrote to territorial health authorities, have created an environment where frontier families thrive rather than merely survive. By spring, requests for Margaret's consultation extended beyond the territory. A delegation from Minnesota arrived to study the system for their logging camps. Canadian officials investigated applications for their western settlements. The woman who'd invested her husband's insurance money in canvas had created an innovation studied by governments and institutions. Yet Margaret remained focused on local impact, teaching freely and improving constantly. The second winter had proven her concept beyond doubt. Tent protection wasn't just viable, but transformative. Professor Wilhelm Steinberg from the newly established Dakota Agricultural College arrived in Willow Creek during March 1876 to study what academic circles called the Olsen phenomenon. His team of engineers and mathematicians came to quantify what Margaret had discovered through intuition and necessity. Their findings would transform frontier architecture understanding and validate principles Margaret had implemented through careful observation rather than formal calculation. The thermodynamics astonished the academics. Steinberg's measurements showed the air gap between tent and cabin created an insulation value equivalent to 12 inches of sawdust fill, then considered the gold standard for cold protection. The canvas membrane breathed enough to prevent condensation while blocking wind completely. Temperature gradients within the tent space created natural convection that distributed heat evenly. Margaret's accidental engineering matched theoretical ideals that universities were just beginning to understand. Wind behavior around the tent structures fascinated the meteorologist on Steinberg's team. The curved canvas surfaces created aerodynamic flow that prevented snow accumulation while reducing structural stress. Vortices formed at calculated points, scouring snow away from critical areas. The tent shape Margaret had developed through trial and error matched optimal designs derived from complex mathematics. She intuited what we calculate, Steinberg noted in his journal. The economic analysis proved equally remarkable. Cost-benefit calculations showed tent construction paid for itself in 1.3 winters through fuel savings alone. Adding health benefits, productivity increases, and structure preservation extended return on investment to 400% over 5 years. The banker McPherson had instinctively recognized what academic analysis confirmed. Tent protection was the frontier's best investment. Steinberg's team recommended territorial funding for widespread implementation. Margaret participated actively in the scientific study, sharing her notebooks filled with 5 years of observations. The professors marveled at her methodical documentation of wind patterns, snow loads, temperature variations, and fuel consumption. Her data provided real-world validation for their theories. More importantly, her practical insights corrected several academic assumptions. Theory must bend to reality, she told Steinberg, when his calculations conflicted with her experience. The wind doesn't read textbooks. The collaborative process enriched both parties. Margaret learned mathematical principles underlying her intuitive designs, allowing further optimization. The academics gained practical wisdom that no laboratory could provide. Together they developed improved specifications that balanced theoretical efficiency with frontier construction reality. The synthesis created designs that were both scientifically sound and practically buildable. Steinberg's published report elevated Margaret's innovation from local success to scientific principle. Engineering schools began teaching tent protection as exemplar of environmental design. The report's dedication read, "To Mrs. Margaret Olsen, who proved that necessity, observation, and determination exceed formal education in solving real problems." Academic validation brought national attention, but Margaret remained focused on local teaching and continuous improvement. Science had explained her success, but intuition and desperation had created it. The professor's parting words captured the profound impact. "We came to study shelter, but discovered philosophy. Mrs. Olsen doesn't just protect wood from moisture, she demonstrates how humans can work with, rather than against, natural forces. This principle will influence architecture far beyond frontier settlements. By 1877, the Olsen tent movement had spread across the northern frontier like seeds carried on prairie wind. From Minnesota logging camps to Montana mining towns, canvas shelters protecting vital resources became symbols of adaptation and community wisdom. Margaret's innovation, born from one widow's desperate winter, had evolved into a frontier revolution that challenged traditional building practices and created new social structures wherever it took root. The railroad companies became unexpected champions of tent protection. The Northern Pacific Railway, building through brutal winter conditions, adopted modified tent structures for worker shelters and supply storage. Their engineers calculated that tent-protected camps reduced winter construction delays by 60%. Workers stayed healthier, supplies remained usable, and progress continued through weather that previously halted all activity. The railway commissioned Margaret to consult on standardized designs for different climates and purposes. Commercial manufacture emerged to meet growing demand. The Morrison Trading Company partnered with Eastern textile mills to produce Dakota Storm tents using Margaret's specifications. These pre-made kits included reinforced canvas, proper stakes, ventilation systems, and instruction manuals illustrated by Margaret's daughter Greta. Sales reached across the frontier and into Canada. Margaret received royalties that finally provided financial security, though she insisted prices remain affordable for frontier families. International interest developed through unexpected channels. Norwegian immigrants recognized similarities to traditional stave construction, but marveled at the portability and adaptability. They wrote home describing the innovation, leading to inquiries from Scandinavian agricultural departments. Russian settlers from the steppes found the concept particularly suitable for their harsh winters. The tent design crossed cultural boundaries because it addressed universal needs, protection, efficiency, and affordability. The social transformation continued deepening. Settlements with widespread tent adoption showed different development patterns than traditional frontier towns. Community cooperation increased as shared knowledge proved vital for survival. Women gained particular prominence as tent construction and maintenance often fell to them, while men worked away. Margaret's example inspired other women innovators who began solving frontier challenges through practical engineering. The tents sheltered more than wood. They protected emerging social changes. Educational institutions embraced the movement's lessons. The Dakota Agricultural College established a practical innovation department inspired by Margaret's example. Students studied real problems and developed solutions through observation and experimentation rather than pure theory. Margaret guest lectured annually, her presentations drawing standing room crowds. Young women particularly attended, seeing possibilities for their own contributions to frontier development. Hans Olsen, now 20 and studying engineering, presented his own innovation to the Territorial Exposition, collapsible tent frames, allowing easy seasonal assembly. His design, building on his mother's foundation, won first prize and launch orders from military suppliers. The second generation was advancing the revolution. Greta published illustrated guides that spread construction knowledge to isolated homesteads. Even young Anna, at 13, taught tent maintenance at the settlement school. The movement had grown beyond Margaret's control or complete understanding. Her simple solution to wet firewood had become architectural philosophy, social catalyst, and economic driver across thousands of miles of frontier. Yet she remained focused on continuous improvement, teaching freely, and ensuring no family suffered through preventable cold. The tents rising across the prairie stood as monuments to practical wisdom and shared knowledge. Margaret Olsen died peacefully on October 14, 1912, surrounded by 3 generations of family in her modern Minneapolis home. She was 73, having lived to see her desperate innovation transform from frontier necessity to established architectural principle. Her final words, recorded by granddaughter Emma, were characteristically practical. "Keep the wood dry and share what you learn." They buried her next to Eric, beneath a headstone reading simply, "She sheltered many." The funeral drew hundreds, including territorial governors, railway executives, and professors. But the majority were ordinary frontier families whose lives had been saved or transformed by tent protection. Thomas Garrett, now white-haired and bent, spoke for them all. Margaret Olsen taught us that innovation isn't about education or wealth. It's about seeing problems clearly and refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable. Every warm winter night, we remembered her gift. The Olsen tent legacy extended far beyond individual survival stories. By 1900, over 10,000 protective structures based on Margaret's principles sheltered frontier families. Engineering textbooks featured chapters on microclimate creation through membrane structures. Military manuals included tent protection in cold weather doctrine. The Canadian government credited Olsen-style shelters with enabling Western settlement. The innovation born from one widow's grief had influenced continental development. Economic impact proved equally profound. Historians calculated that tent protection saved frontier settlements millions in reduced fuel consumption, prevented losses, and increased productivity. The banker McPherson's early support had proven visionary. Communities with widespread tent adoption showed significantly higher survival and growth rates. The $80 Margaret invested in Canvas had multiplied into immeasurable economic benefit across the frontier. Her innovation demonstrated how individual solutions could transform regional economies. Social changes persisted through generations. Communities that embraced tent protection and its philosophy of shared innovation developed differently. They showed higher cooperation levels, more women in leadership roles, and greater acceptance of unconventional solutions. The physical structures had created social structures, bonds formed in shared sanctuary and sustained through collective learning. Margaret's open teaching model became template for frontier knowledge exchange, prioritizing community benefit over individual profit. The original tent had been preserved and stood reconstructed in the Willow Creek Historical Museum. School children touched the canvas and tried to imagine desperation that drove innovation. They learned how Margaret transformed grief into gift, personal tragedy into public benefit. Teachers explained technical principles but emphasized human elements, determination, observation, and willingness to think differently. The tent stood as monument to frontier ingenuity and feminine engineering excellence. Modern engineers studying sustainable architecture rediscovered Margaret's principles with surprise and admiration. Her microclimate creation anticipated passive solar design. Her emphasis on adaptability preceded flexible architecture by decades. Her community-based innovation model offered alternatives to proprietary development. Graduate students wrote dissertations on the Olsen method as example of indigenous engineering wisdom. The frontier widow had been decades ahead of academic understanding. In the end, Margaret Olsen's legacy wasn't merely technical, but philosophical. She proved that survival required adaptation, that innovation arose from necessity, and that knowledge belonged to communities rather than individuals. Every tent raised across the frontier carried her fundamental lesson. When traditional methods fail, create new ones. The canvas that neighbors mocked had sheltered thousands and would inspire millions. 20 years after Margaret Olsen's death, her grandchildren carried the innovation forward in ways she never imagined. Emma Olsen Mitchell, Hans's daughter, had earned her engineering degree from the University of Minnesota in 1932, a rare achievement for women. Her thesis, Thermal Dynamics of Membrane Structures, built directly on her grandmother's empirical observations, adding mathematical precision to intuitive design. She stood before the American Society of Civil Engineers, the only woman in the room, presenting innovations that would revolutionize temporary shelter construction. Emma's breakthrough involved modular tent systems that could expand or contract based on seasonal needs. Where Margaret had built fixed structures, Emma created flexible frameworks allowing families to add or remove sections as required. Summer configurations provided maximum ventilation and workspace. Winter arrangements minimized volume while maximizing heat retention. The adaptability addressed criticisms that permanent tent structures were unsightly or restrictive during warm months. Brother Thomas Olsen Garrett, named for the family friend, had taken the innovation in agricultural directions. Working with the Department of Agriculture, he developed tent systems for crop protection, extending growing seasons in northern climates. His growth chambers used transparent materials and thermal mass principles to create microclimates for vegetables. Dakota farmers using his designs harvested tomatoes weeks after killing frosts. The widow's wood protection had evolved into food security innovation. The third generation's most profound contribution came through systematic documentation. Emma and Thomas collaborated on the Prairie Innovation Handbook, combining Margaret's original notebooks with modern engineering principles and decades of community refinements. Published in 1935, it became standard reference across rural America. The book democratized knowledge Margaret had shared freely, ensuring isolated homesteads could access accumulated wisdom. Libraries reported it as their most requested agricultural text. International applications had expanded beyond anyone's imagination. Soviet agricultural planners facing similar challenges in Siberian settlements translated Emma's work and implemented massive tent-protected communities. Australian outback stations adapted the principles for heat protection rather than cold. Argentine ranchers used modified designs for equipment protection on the pampas. Margaret's response to Dakota winters had become global shelter solution. The economic impact by 1935 was staggering. A University of Chicago study calculated that tent protection and its derivatives had saved American frontier communities over $50 million in fuel, health costs, and productivity losses. The investment in canvas protection showed returns exceeding 1,000% over 50 years. More importantly, thousands of lives had been saved through consistent warmth and community shelter during disasters. Yet the family remained focused on Margaret's core values. Emma insisted on affordable licensing for basic designs. Thomas provided free consultations to struggling communities. They established the Olsen Foundation supporting women's practical engineering education. At every presentation, Emma began with her grandmother's story, the widow who spent insurance money on canvas and changed the world. The third generation understood their inheritance wasn't just technical knowledge, but responsibility to share innovation freely. The tent movement had become institution, but its heart remained Margaret's simple insight: when traditional methods fail, observe carefully and create solutions. Her grandchildren carried that philosophy into new challenges, always remembering that innovation arose from necessity and belonged to community. The Great Depression and Dust Bowl catastrophes of the 1930s provided unexpected validation of Margaret Olsen's innovation as desperate farm families discovered that tent protection principles could address more than winter cold. As banks foreclosed on mortgage properties and dust storms buried dreams under mountains of dirt, the adaptability of membrane shelter systems proved crucial for survival. Emma Olsen Mitchell found herself consulting not on cold protection, but on creating livable spaces within environmental disaster. The dust storm of April 14, 1935, Black Sunday, demonstrated tent protection's versatility dramatically. Families who had erected canvas barriers around their homes found the membranes filtered dust while allowing breathability. The Garrett family descendants in Kansas reported their tent-wrapped house remained habitable, while neighbors abandoned homes filled with choking dirt. The same principles that kept snow out proved effective against driven dust, creating refuges within the black blizzards. Emma developed emergency modifications for Dust Bowl conditions. Working with desperate communities, she designed double-membrane systems with damp cloth between layers for dust filtration. Ventilation systems borrowed from Margaret's original winter designs but reversed, keeping particles out rather than managing moisture. The tent spaces became workshops and living areas when houses proved unbearable. Federal relief agencies began distributing modified tent kits as emergency shelter solutions. Economic desperation drove remarkable innovations. Families who couldn't afford manufactured canvas created tent-like structures from feed sacks, worn clothing, and any available fabric. The principle mattered more than materials, creating protected microclimates using membrane barriers. Emma documented these adaptations, recognizing that necessity was again driving innovation. Her reports influenced federal policy on disaster relief, emphasizing adaptable shelter over rigid construction. The social impact paralleled Margaret's original community transformation. Tent-protected spaces became gathering points during dust storms, sheltering multiple families when individual homes failed. Women organized tent schools, ensuring education continued despite environmental catastrophe. Medical stations operated in filtered tent environments when hospitals proved inadequate. The physical structures again created social structures, bonds of survival, and shared innovation that would define Dust Bowl resilience. International observers studied American tent adaptations with growing interest. Japanese engineers, anticipating war conditions, analyzed dust filtration techniques. British colonial administrators investigated applications for sandstorm protection. Soviet planners expanded their cold-weather tent cities to include dust defense. The innovation born on Dakota Prairie had become global disaster response tool, applicable wherever environmental extremes challenged human habitation. Thomas Olsen Garrett's agricultural innovations proved equally vital. His protected growing systems allowed subsistence food production when open fields became moonscapes. Families surviving on relief could supplement with vegetables grown in tent chambers. The psychological benefit of producing food during agricultural apocalypse proved as important as nutritional value. Green plants growing in protected spaces provided hope when landscape offered only desolation. By decade's end, tent protection had evolved from winter wood storage solution to comprehensive environmental shelter system. The Olsen principles, observe problems, create solutions, share knowledge, had proven applicable across catastrophes. Margaret's legacy lived not in specific designs, but in approach to innovation. Her grandchildren had honored that legacy by adapting core insights to new challenges while maintaining commitment to community benefit over profit. World War II brought Margaret Olsen's tent innovations to global prominence as military planners recognized applications for rapid deployment shelter systems. Emma Olsen Mitchell, now in her 50s, found herself consulting for the War Department on protective structures for everything from ammunition storage to field hospitals. The widow's wood-drying solution had evolved into a strategic military asset, protecting supplies and personnel across every theater of war. The Arctic convoys to Russia particularly benefited from Olsen principles. Ships carrying vital supplies faced not just U-boats, but crushing ice and freezing spray that could encase entire vessels. Protective canvas systems based on Margaret's designs shielded critical equipment and deck cargo. Sailors who had mocked tent ships changed opinions when protected vessels arrived with intact cargo, while others lost significant materials to weather damage. The membranes that saved frontier firewood now protected democracy's arsenal. Pacific theater applications proved equally innovative. Marines establishing beachheads used modified tent systems for rapid supply protection in tropical conditions. The same ventilation principles that prevented mold in Dakota wood storage created habitable spaces in jungle humidity. Field hospitals reported dramatically reduced infection rates when operating in tent-protected environments versus open tropical conditions. Military medical journals published papers on the Olsen effect in combat casualty care. Post-war reconstruction saw explosive global adoption. Devastated European cities needed immediate shelter for millions. Traditional construction couldn't meet demand, but tent-based transitional housing could be erected quickly using military surplus materials. Emma consulted on massive projects creating temporary communities that borrowed social organization from frontier tent settlements. Protected common spaces fostered community rebuilding alongside physical reconstruction. The 1950s brought unexpected renaissance as prosperity allowed innovation beyond survival needs. Architects discovered aesthetic possibilities in membrane structures, creating dramatic public buildings inspired by Margaret's functional forms. The Sydney Opera House's sail-like design traced conceptual ancestry to Dakota tent protection. Modern materials, synthetic fabrics, aluminum frames, engineered membranes, expanded possibilities while maintaining core principles of protected microclimates. Academic recognition culminated in 1956 when Emma received the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, first woman so honored. Her acceptance speech brought standing ovation. My grandmother, Margaret Olsen, never studied architecture. She studied survival and discovered architecture along the way. Every innovation I've achieved builds on her foundation. Observe carefully, solve practically, share freely. Tent protection saved frontier families. May we honor that legacy by ensuring our innovations serve human needs rather than ego. The Olsen Foundation, established by Margaret's grandchildren, had funded education for over 1,000 women in practical engineering fields. Recipients worked globally, adapting membrane protection to local challenges. Brazilian favelas gained weather protection. African refugee camps improved through ventilation designs. Indian monsoon regions adopted water-shedding configurations. The prairie innovation had become universal human shelter solution. As space race began, NASA engineers studied Olsen tent principles for lunar habitat design, creating livable spaces in hostile environments using minimal materials directly paralleled Margaret's original challenge. The great-granddaughter of frontier widow consulted on structures intended for other worlds. Canvas protecting firewood had led to membranes protecting astronauts. The trajectory from desperate innovation to space exploration exemplified American pragmatism and possibility. Today, visitors to the Margaret Olsen Memorial Museum in Willow Creek, North Dakota, walk through a faithful reconstruction of her original tent-wrapped cabin. Modern sensors display real-time temperature differentials, airflow patterns, and humidity levels, quantifying what Margaret understood through observation and necessity. School groups touch the canvas, try splitting wood in the protected space, and struggle to imagine the desperation that drove such innovation. Yet her legacy extends far beyond museum walls into the very fabric of human shelter design. The statistics tell only part of the story. Over 10 million structures worldwide incorporate Olsen principles of membrane protection and microclimate creation. From Antarctic research stations to refugee camps, from military deployments to disaster relief, the concept of protected intermediate spaces saves lives daily. Modern materials and computer modeling have refined designs, but core insights remain unchanged. Work with natural forces, create buffered environments, share knowledge freely. Climate change has made Margaret's innovation newly relevant. As extreme weather events increase, the ability to create resilient shelter using minimal resources becomes critical. The Olsen Foundation, now in its fourth generation of family leadership, focuses on climate adaptation for vulnerable communities. They distribute open-source designs for membrane shelters addressing flooding, heat waves, and storms. The tent that protected against 1870s blizzards now shields against 21st century climate chaos. Social scientists study Olsen communities, settlements that adopted tent protection early, finding persistent differences generations later. These communities show higher cooperation indices, greater acceptance of innovation, and stronger women's leadership representation. The physical structures created social patterns that endured beyond the original need. Margaret's tent didn't just save firewood, it fundamentally altered how communities approached challenges and shared solutions. The philosophical impact may exceed the practical. Margaret Olsen proved that innovation doesn't require credentials, funding, or permission, just clear observation of problems and determination to solve them. Her story inspires inventors worldwide, particularly women in traditional societies who see possibility in her example. The Olsen method, observe, innovate, share, has become problem-solving framework taught in contexts from elementary schools to engineering colleges. Modern engineers marvel at her intuitive grasp of complex principles. Computational fluid dynamics confirms her ventilation patterns approached theoretical optimization. Materials science validates her layering strategies. Thermodynamic analysis shows her heat conservation methods matched advanced calculations. She achieved through necessity and observation what others derived through years of study. This humbles professionals while inspiring amateurs. Genius emerges from need more than knowledge. As humanity faces unprecedented challenges, Margaret Olsen's legacy grows more relevant. Her response to personal tragedy, transforming grief into gift, models resilience. Her open sharing of life-saving knowledge exemplifies community values. Her proof that simple solutions can address complex problems encourages innovation. The canvas tent protecting firewood has become metaphor for human adaptability and generosity. Standing in the reconstructed tent, visitors often fall silent, sensing something sacred in the space. Here, a widow's determination to keep her children warm launched innovations that would shelter millions. The dried wood stacked neatly around canvas walls represents more than fuel. It embodies human capacity to transform suffering into solution, isolation into community, survival into thriving. Margaret Olsen's tent continues its essential work, protecting what matters most. The 21st century brought unexpected revival of Margaret Olsen's tent innovation as sustainable living advocates rediscovered the elegance of her simple solution. Architecture students at MIT analyzed her original notebooks, now digitized and available worldwide, finding principles that surpassed many computer-optimized designs. The great-great-granddaughter Sarah Olsen Park presented at TED conferences about ancestral wisdom, meeting modern challenges. My ancestor didn't have CAD software or climate models, she explained. She had wet firewood and dying children. Necessity created genius that education often overlooks. Maker movements embraced tent protection as DIY empowerment symbol. YouTube channels dedicated to Olsen-style builds garnered millions of views as young people discovered they could create effective shelter without construction expertise or significant funding. The comment sections filled with stories, urban gardeners protecting plants, homeless advocates creating emergency shelters, disaster preppers building resilient systems. Margaret's innovation had become open-source inspiration for new generations facing different but parallel challenges. Climate refugees particularly benefited from evolved tent technologies. As rising seas and extreme weather displaced millions, rapid deployment shelter systems based on Olsen principles provided immediate relief. Modern materials, recycled plastics, solar collection fabrics, smart membranes, enhanced capabilities while maintaining core simplicity. UN refugee agencies standardized Olsen shelter modules, providing protected spaces that fostered community formation alongside physical protection. The tent saved lives across centuries and continents. Economic analyses showed tent protection's continued relevance. As energy costs soared and climate extremes intensified, the passive microclimate management Margaret pioneered offered solutions requiring no power grid connection. Off-grid communities adopted tent wrapping as standard practice. Urban buildings incorporated membrane second skins, reducing heating and cooling costs by 60%. The $80 Margaret invested in Canvas had spawned billion-dollar industries while remaining accessible to anyone with fabric and determination. Cultural impact deepened through artistic interpretation. The Prairie Wind Ballet performed Canvas Dreams, telling Margaret's story through movement. Musicians composed the Tent Symphony, with movements representing seasons of protection. Poets found metaphor in membrane barriers, permeable yet protective, flexible yet strong. Margaret had become more than historical figure. She embodied human resilience and community care. Artists recognized in her story universal themes transcending time and technology. Educational integration reached from kindergarten to graduate school. Elementary students built model tents, learning basic engineering. High schoolers studied thermodynamics through tent protection principles. University researchers pursued advanced applications from space habitats to disaster response. The Olsen method, observe, innovate, share, became standard problem-solving framework across disciplines. Margaret's necessity-driven innovation demonstrated that profound solutions emerge from clear problem definition rather than complex technology. Social media spread tent innovations globally at unprecedented speed. Instagram posts showing tent transformations inspired copycats worldwide. TikTok challenges featured creative protection solutions. Facebook groups connected tent builders across continents, sharing adaptations for local conditions. The community Margaret fostered in Frontier, Dakota, had become global network united by shared principles rather than geography. Digital communication amplified her core value. Knowledge belongs to community, not individuals. The tent's third century of protection had begun with Margaret's principles, more relevant than ever. As humanity faced climate chaos, resource depletion, and social upheaval, her example of transforming personal crisis into community benefit resonated profoundly. Standing in her tent-protected garden in Minneapolis, 93-year-old Anna Olsen Lindquist, Margaret's last surviving child, smiled at the reporter's question about her mother's legacy. "People think it was about the tent," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "But it was never about canvas and poles. It was about refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable. Mother saw neighbors freezing with wet wood and decided that wasn't acceptable. The tent was just her solution. The legacy is the deciding." Anna's own tent, modified with modern materials but following Margaret's essential design, sheltered a thriving winter garden. At her age, she shouldn't have been able to maintain such productivity, but the protected microclimate made it possible. "I'm still teaching mother's lessons," she explained, showing neighborhood children how to split kindling properly. "Keep your resources dry, share what you learn, never accept that the way things are is the way they must be." The economic impact of Margaret's innovation had been calculated repeatedly, always growing with each analysis. Harvard Business School's comprehensive study concluded that tent protection and its derivatives had generated over $2 trillion in saved resources, prevented losses, and enabled productivity over 150 years. But Anna waved away such figures. Mother would have laughed at those numbers. She just wanted her children warm. Everything else followed from that simple need. Cultural transformation proved equally profound, but harder to quantify. Societies that embraced Olsen principles, observation-based innovation, community knowledge sharing, practical,